Today's topic for the podcast actually comes from a conversation I was having with some friends over dinner. We were talking about kind of like the U.S. economy, and we were at a restaurant. It was packed, which is usually a traditional indicator for how well the economy is doing, right? When you have a little bit more money in your pocket, you're able to spend a little bit more, you're able to go out and indulge in a few things. So, we were sitting there kind of discussing how the end of last year, there was a dip in the economy, late 2018, but it's bounced back relatively well and relatively quickly here in 2019. And we are sharing this from our perspective. I am a son of immigrants. I can look at it from this perspective of how my parents contributed to this country, how I continue and my siblings continue to contribute to this country and to the U.S. economy.
There is a sentiment that when you just said that, it's like there is so much work behind us, and we continue to try to justify our presence into this economy when we have been here for generations. I mean, if you go back to some of the history of United States and how it developed its territory, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that gave literally 4 states to U.S. territory, and those are states that were Mexican, and that population remained in that space. There is 2 halves of perhaps Latino populations. One, the Latinos that have been here for many, many generations, and then are immigrating from other Latin American countries. And I'd like to, as we discuss the topic, talk about these 2 halves, as they have and carry unique characteristics, but at the same time, and they also share the cultural values that define a Latino culture.
But before we go any further, let's go ahead and take a break. We'll be right back. LatinX Point of View is brought to you by Civic Canvas, a bilingual boutique firm designing strategies for social change. To learn more at civiccanvas.com.
When I was doing some research for the topic that we're talking about today, one of the things that kind of popped out at me, looking up consumer stats for Latinx individuals, and one of the things that jumped out at me was that Latinos' gross domestic product in 2015, the GDP, was $2.1 trillion. And that to me was remarkable. That was U.S. Latinos. GDP $2.1 trillion. And if you look at that GDP as if it were an independent country, it would be the 7th largest GDP in the world, more than Italy, yes, India, Canada, and Brazil. I thought that was nuts. The spending power, the buying power that we have in this country.
So when you think about the rising of the Latino class and what is our role in this economy, it seems that it's not negotiable. We're here, and we're here as a very strong producer and contributor to the economy. Growth of the Latino population. One stat that I like to quote is that every 30 seconds there is a Latino that turns 18. This means there is a Latino who is willing and able to buy a house, buy a car, have children, send them to school, have a career, have loans, have assets. To me, there is something about the ability of this population to actually stop being looked at as second-class contributors. We are now a minority nation where the bilingual bicultural is actually creating not only a contribution to the economy, but a growth to the economy when you think about the globalization of any type of role that we will have in the world.
And one of the things that's interesting to me is how very young the median age is of Latinos in the U.S., and that gives us a kind of a great upside to go forward. In some of the stats that I found, between 2010 and 2015, the number of Latino college grads between the age of 20 to 24 grew by 40.6% compared to 13.6% for non-Latino grads. When we are talking about who's going out and who's buying a home, who's buying a car, these are some of these young folks who are college educated and the impact that they're putting into their local economies.
Let me just bring this back to why, when you're sharing those statistics, it just makes me and continue to think. One of the characteristics of Latinos is that we are community minded. And as we are community minded, we look out for each other in community. And that is something in an economy that you want that characteristic, because there is a group investment. It's not an individual investment. Is a reliance that comes from always looking out for the rest of the community. And what you also think about this, the other half that are immigrating into the U.S. willingly, those are people who are coming with the one goal, and the only goal they have is to build assets. They want to acquire the American dream. And the American dream is about consumption. It's about getting things at a very affordable price. While you work really hard, you are able to purchase. And those purchases translate into an incredible flow of dollars into each economy, into each local economy. So some people will have perhaps a reaction about the environmental impact of immigration and the immigrants that are coming, and perhaps in this topic, Latinos. But when you think about the environmental, there is a give and take that we have on how we contribute and also consume. This is actually a one-on-one ratio. I don't think that there is more that we take from the more that we give.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because, the Latino GDP is actually projected to be almost 25% of the U.S. GDP by 2020. So let's take that into account. If we're talking about the U.S. as a whole and the gross domestic product, 25% by 2020, that's incredible. So anybody who tells me that does the U.S. economy need Latinos, I'm like, yeah, you definitely do if you want to keep growing as a country and be prosperous. And this is a segment that companies have been kind of targeting for years. And I'd love to see the evolution of how companies are trying to message Latino consumers, going back to your point of Latino consumers being some of those that want to have that American dream, want to be able to buy the house, want to be able to buy the car, want to be able to have nice things and have what we call expendable income. So I can recall companies like McDonald's, Wells Fargo, Target, and having bilingual commercials to attract this demographic. One that stands out to me, one that came out about 2-3 years ago, was Wells Fargo. They showed a young Latina female kind of come in, say, "Hola, abuelita," and then the grandmother replies in English, "Hola, mija," stuff like that. And then she said, "How's your first check?" And the dynamics between the two languages just felt so normal for what I see in most Latino families nowadays, between the balance and culture, that one of the things that stands out to me is family. When you surround it around that kind of one of the basic principles of what the Latino culture is surrounded around your family. When we actually think of this from perspective of how do Latinx consumers impact the U.S. economy, well, if you want to have an economy that's based on people providing for theirs, then I think we impact it really well.
Local economies are developed in global context. It seems that this acclamation of Latino presence and finally the acknowledgement of Latino presence has become polarized. And the reason I say it's non-negotiable because there is just no way that this could actually be erased. If any economy will collapse if this was to be dramatically removed. When it actually comes back from almost pain and suffering, this upgrade of how people are looking at the consumer, at the Latino consumer. I remember that we're talking about maybe 15 years ago. Locally, I led a lot of cultural competency trainings. And this was because most organizations in town, nonprofit organizations, they didn't know how to approach the subject of Latinos. They didn't know how to approach just to have them walk into their doors. This was an awareness moment. An awareness goes behind an action, and action creates some type of culture competency. And this means they upgraded their websites, they upgraded some of their literature, they started pitching some of their in Spanish. To me, there is growth, but there is not this open-minded growth. It's almost with pain and suffering, we will look at you as a consumer until you're worth it. Now, we are worth it already because I just cited our GDP. But why do we have to continue to prove that we contribute if we know we already do? Now, we are a bilingual global force. We're not a local workforce. We're bilingual global workforce. And most European countries pride themselves into having workforce who are trilingual, polylingual. And it's very uncommon to hear someone that is monolingual. Here, the attitude towards bilingual in this country is as if you have not chosen your culture. And that is something that it is the irony of having two languages and having to apologize for one. As a consumer, as a producer, you want that bilingual abilities and you want to actually promote that into the schools. And we continue to locally and nationally champion for bilingual education. Now, I don't want to get off topic, but I'm trying to look at the skills that are already innate in a community that is bilingual and bicultural. Now, if you only think the other half that immigrated to this country as a first generation, second generation, those are folks who already have a foreign experience. They don't need to be introduced to international relations. We already have a framework of how other people live and practice their cultures. Now, there is a very small gap of what you need to tell me about moving into a different country and acting into that country. I already know. Now, most folks don't see that as an asset. When you think about the economy, there is a very formula of any type of social economy that will say, we don't want skilled labor.
Well, you didn't want to get off topic, but we are talking about the myths that people have about Latinos in the U.S. So it kind of goes to that. The language can be something, and one of the things that I've seen as an evolution of over the last 40, 50 years with talking with some folks is how much Latinos have come to embrace their culture in current generations and maybe Generation X moving forward. And the reason why I say this is I've run into a lot of Latino individuals who might have come to the United States as young children in the 1960s, and they were discouraged from speaking their language because they were told, you want to assimilate because you don't want to have an accent. And they try to pass that down to their children. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. One of the biggest regrets, I had a conversation with a gentleman one day from California, and he said, my parents were Mexican and they spoke Spanish. And one of my biggest regrets was they didn't teach me Spanish. And you know what I told them? Hey, man, it's never too late to be bilingual and pick up another language if you want. So I think that's really on point to what you're saying about kind of breaking these myths. And we're seeing companies either saying that's a value or saying, I respect the fact that you are bicultural and I want to respect that in how I advertise to you. Let's take a quick break right now and we'll come back with our next segment. The LatinX Point of View podcast was brought to you by L5 Consultants, a company committed to helping bridge cultural differences. You can find them on Twitter at L5 Consultants or on the web at l5online.com.
So now that we're back, to pick up on something that I thought when you talk about economy, now most of the Latino population is a very young population. It's about less than 29 years old. This is the prime population. Now let me give you a teaser about what happens when you have a young population. And of course, the opportunity growth of this population is greater, but also how long they will remain in the workforce. We're talking about 60 or so years. Now, when you think of a workforce that will be contributing to the U.S. economy and especially to the Social Security retirement accounts, that's the kind of population you want to have. Why? Because at Latinos, do we contribute to the economy? And I would love for you to expand on the topic of contribution, of tax contribution. How do we, if our buying power eventually is going to be millennials, all millennials and over 65 combined. So think about the buying power that we will gain. And our contribution to any type of retirement account This is actually the only answer available in the economy to sustain the population through the Social Security